Number 48, The War on Truth and the Struggle for Democracy, a conversation with Katherine Stewart. I'm Jim Burke, the producer. In this gripping episode of The Way Forward Regenerative Conversations, we dive deeply into the explosive revelations of Katherine Stewart's new book, Money, Lies, and God. With nearly 2 decades of investigative journalism exposing the rise of Christian nationalism and anti-democratic forces reshaping America, Stewart reveals the unholy alliance of billionaires, culture warriors, and ideological extremists working to dismantle our democratic foundations. This conversation is essential listening for anyone who cares about truth, pluralism, and the future of the American experiment. Katherine Stewart is an award-winning journalist and New York Times bestselling author who has covered the rise of the anti-democratic movement in the U.S. for over 16 years. Her latest book, Money, Lies, and God, Inside the Movement to Destroy American Democracy, builds on the critically acclaimed The Power Worshippers and the Good News Club. Stewart's work appears in the New York Times, The New Republic, and Religious News Service. Follow her at her website. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please subscribe to our podcast and visit our website at www.wayforwardpodcast.com to join our community, explore show archives, and stay connected. Special thanks to our sponsors, Elders Action Network and Elders Climate Action. Their support makes these vital conversations possible. And now for our hosts, Dr. John Izzo and Alain Gauthier.
Hi, I'm Dr. John Izzo, and on behalf of my co-host, Alain Gauthier, I want to welcome you to this episode of the Way Forward podcast, where we explore ideas and issues about the future of humanity and planet, especially from the perspective of those over 50 and what we can do in this generation to make a difference. But whatever age or stage of life you're at, we welcome you. We're glad you're here. Now, today we've got an exciting podcast really exploring a very important issue at this moment in America and maybe in the world, which is the emergence of the new right in America and in other countries, though we're going to focus on America today, and also the rise of Christian nationalism and the impact that this might have on our society. But before we get started, I want to ask a question. Who the hell cares about Harvard? I mean, look, it's an elite school filled with egghead professors and rich kids, right? Well, first of all, it's not filled with just rich kids. I can tell you that because one of my friends growing up who was a pastor's kid, a Presbyterian pastor's kid, went to Harvard. And I tell you, he didn't have a lot of money, but it was a great gift for him to go to Harvard. But really, who cares? But let me tell you why I think everyone, no matter where you are on the political spectrum, whether you love Donald Trump and agree with his ideas or vehemently oppose them, why all of us should care very much about what's happening at Harvard. Now, underneath all the noise, the bottom line is that this is an attack on free speech. The goal of this administration is to have universities teach the things that they want them to teach, to have the students that they want to have there with the political views that they have. And they've threatened all kinds of things to make that happen, from shutting down the ability of Harvard to have foreign students, which for universities in America is the lifeblood financially, whether we like it or not, to removing their tax-exempt status. But you might say, hey, I agree with Donald Trump. I agree that these universities are teaching elitist left-wing propaganda. I agree that anyone who is pro-Palestinian, that I disagree with that viewpoint. And fair enough, you have the right to believe that. But let's imagine for a moment the precedent that this is setting, because this isn't about Harvard. It's really about America. At the bedrock of American democracy from the very beginning, what made us different at the time than any other country in the world was the right to free speech, the right to free assembly, the right to disagree, whether you were in the majority or not. So just imagine 3.5 years from now that a new president is elected, a left-wing president, a true left-wing radical, let's say, and a Congress to go along with it. And they suddenly decide, hey, they've set the precedent. We're going to start telling Christian universities in America that they need to either get with the program or we'll take away their tax-exempt status. That we want the names of any student who's attended an anti-abortion rally Because if they're a foreign student, we want to make sure they can't stay in America. I think you get the idea. You see, you can't have it both ways. We either believe in free speech and the right to assembly, or we don't. And let me say, I, for one, have been consistent on this issue. In recent years, when liberal students and liberal professors have tried to shut down legitimate conservative voices on campus, boycott them, and make noise so they can't speak, I spoke out against it because I'm for free speech. I'm for free assembly because that's what America was built on. So be careful what you ask for. You may not think you care about Harvard, but you should. Now, one of the major issues in American democracy today is the rise of the new movement in America and really the reshaped Republican Party. And that's where we're going to focus today. Having grown up in a Rockefeller Republican household in New York, Nelson Rockefeller was the governor of New York, a moderate Republican who was liberal on environmental issues and the role of government, but conservative on fiscal issues, et cetera. But that party is almost non-existent now in America. Rather, what we have is a reshaped American right that is having an impact on our society in profound ways. And what we're going to do today, well, there are so many things about our democracy that need to change, from the polarization to the role of money, to the role of social media, to a two-party system locked into a win or lose, for you or against you mentality. But today we want to focus on the emergence of this new right with our wonderful guest, Katherine Stewart. And Alana, I'm going to turn it over to you to get us started.
Yes, welcome, Katherine. It's wonderful to have you. And I'm going to start with the initial question as what inspired you to write your new book, Money, Lies, and God?
Thank you so much for the question. I want to thank both of you, John and Alan, for having me on this show. I've been writing about the rise of the movement to destroy American democracy for the past 16 years. Money, Lies, and God is my third book in a series. And I really started down this path 16 years ago when something called a Good News Club came to my daughter's public elementary school. It's an after-school club that inculcates children who are too young to read in a deeply fundamentalist form of the Christian faith, and persuades them that this school sort of fools them into thinking that their public school endorses a very reactionary form of the Christian faith. It uses kids attending the club to recruit their peers. I started researching this club. At every Good News Club that I researched or attended, children were offered candy or points or prizes for recruiting their non-Christian or differently Christian peers to the club. And public schools have a cloak of authority in the minds of very little kids, as we know. They can't make a distinction between an activity in their school and something sponsored by their school. So, long story short, this really sort of bumped up against my understanding of what the separation of church and state entails, and a sort of the idea of the Establishment Clause and the idea of public education, which is supposed to neither affirm nor denigrate any particular form of religion. So I started to research this organization, and pretty soon I recognized that it was just one small part of a much larger movement to basically take over public education, destroy public ed as we know it, and repurpose it with a kind of, I would say, conservative Christian agenda. But that agenda was just one small part of a much larger movement to destroy American democracy as we know it. So I've spent 16 years researching this movement, and it's taken me into some really interesting directions and down some fairly, I would say, eye-opening rabbit holes.
And obviously, Katherine, this is very timely as we speak now. Just in the last few days, the Texas legislature has passed another law. It's been tried in other places like Louisiana to have the 10 Commandments need to be in a very visible way on the wall in every public school in Texas. And one of the interesting things you talk about in your book, I don't want to go deeply into that right now, was that the founding fathers, when they wanted to separate church and state, they'd come from a place in Europe where religion was kind of forced on you. whatever country you lived in, that was the religion you had to practice, or you might pay a price for it. So it's important to understand the founding fathers and mothers. There probably were mothers behind that. We never talk about them. Their intention really was to not have a national religion. And there's lots of argument about how religious many of the founding fathers were, but it's kind of besides the point. Clearly, they did not intend to create a Christian nation. Just talk about that for just a moment, because I think it's an important beginning to this conversation. I grew up, I was a Presbyterian minister. Faith was a very important part of my life. But I always understood from the beginning that the idea wasn't that America was a Christian nation. It was a nation where you could be who you wanted to be. Just talk a bit about that before we dig into some others.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. It's really false to call the United States as a Christian nation or to say it was founded on Judeo-Christian beliefs, which is how some of the folks on the right characterize it. America was founded very clearly as the world's first non-sectarian state, neither with religious freedom guaranteed for all, but with no state religion of any sort. I mean, all you need to do is read the founding documents, read the scholarship. It's fair to say, I think, that while most of the population of the early republic was predominantly Christian, it was divided into a very large number of very different and often mutually antagonistic sects. So pluralism was really part of the American story from the very beginning. We can look at documents that show the United States was explicitly not founded on Christian ideals, such as the Declaration of Independence, which provided one understands the phrase nature's God correctly. Now, nature's God refers to a deist or pantheist idea. A lot of our founders were deists, of course. The idea that God operates not through divine revelation, but instead through the laws of nature, laws that can be studied through science. In essence, it's a more or less secular conception of what God is. And we can also look at the Constitution itself and the Bill of Rights, correspondence of America's founders, in particular between Adams and Jefferson, the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, and so many others.
So, Katherine, most of us sense that what's happening in the right now is different. And I'd like you to kind of tell our listeners, from your view, having studied this now for 16 years and researched it, how is this fundamentally different, and how is it similar to the Reagan Revolution, Newt Gingrich's Contract for America, the Tea Party? Connect the dots for us, not so much a history lesson, but what makes this different than earlier and there's a lot of similarities, but what makes it different and therefore more concerning, more important for us to pay attention to?
Well, there are multiple strands of what we're seeing today. There's a rise of two movements, the Christian nationalist movement, or religious nationalism, as I call it in the subtitle of my last book, The Power Worshippers. And then there's, of course, the rise of the new right, which I would say is less explicitly religious nationalist, but more explicitly anti-democratic. Both of these strands are very hostile to the principles of democracy. They reject the principles of pluralism and equality and rule of law, in fact, and justice that represent the best of the American promise. I think in an earlier era, I mean, there are so many differences. In an earlier era, we can see that the religious right, has always been there. There's always been a kind of strand of reactionary religion in America since the very beginning, but they really weren't. They were sort of outside of the center of power. I think for many years, the Republican Party thought, well, we can make use of these people. They're reliable voters. They're not going to go anywhere. They're never going to vote for the other political party. So they sort of took them for granted, and they didn't recognize for so many years that the Christian nationalist movement, for instance, was building this dense organizational infrastructure that was growing its strength over decades. I remember in 2011, George W. Bush's speechwriter said, this is a movement that could fit into a phone booth. And I read that and thought, is he not paying attention? I mean, the strength of this movement is in this dense organizational infrastructure that's been built up over decades. And unfortunately, what's happened over the last few years is that the wheels of the Republic, guardrails, have really fallen away. from the Republican Party, and now the extremists have kind of taken over. I mean, just think to an earlier era. Think about Richard Nixon when he tried to subvert the Department of Justice. His party said, no, so you're out. They kicked him out. They said, that's not how we do things. And today, I would say the current president pulls a Richard Nixon every day before noon. So we can really see the difference over time.
One of the most interesting things in your book is showing how the rich and powerful have combined with Christian nationalism to shape this new movement. Help our listeners understand this alliance and what it means for all of us. How do you see the alliance between religious nationalism and corporate power threatening democracy?
Thank you so much. You know, let's be really clear. There are a lot of very wealthy people in America. There are a lot of very wealthy corporations, and not all of them are funding this movement. It's only a subsection, and I would argue that it's actually a small subsection of the very wealthy and the corporate leaders. But the amounts of money that they're pouring into the movement are really extraordinary. So in my book, Money Lies in God, I pay a lot of attention to a group that I call the funders. The amounts of money have ballooned over time as we've had sort of vast concentrations of wealth at the very top of the economic ladder. And these folks are investing their fortunes, or at least a portion of them, in anti-democratic projects. And here's something that I found really interesting. Religiously, the funders are all over the place. Some are evangelical, some are Catholic, some are Jewish, some are, frankly, atheistic. Some are driven by cultural and religious concerns, and some aren't. But the thing they share in common is a desire for economic policies that don't just make them richer and allow them to grow their businesses without any pesky regulation involved or any pesky taxes, but of course also that justify their massive concentrations of wealth. They often call themselves pro-capitalist people, and they want a deregulatory environment. They want privileged contracts often for their monopolistic businesses and taxpayer subsidies sometimes. So to that end, they've convinced themselves that the liberal order, sort of liberal democracy itself, needs to be destroyed. But how are they going to get the voters on board with that? The rank and file who are going to sort of, bring those politicians on board who are going to do what the funders want? Well, that's where the culture wars come in. That's where disinformation comes in. So these funders are pouring some of their money into these massive disinformation or propaganda campaigns and networks that exist to basically inculcate fear in the American people, to make them think they're being victimized by a deep state or a woke elite, or that any political opposition to Trump is literally demonic or satanic. So that's sort of the role that the funders play. But there are other groups in this movement as well. Just for the sake of being able to map out the different features of the movement, I talk about the funders, the thinkers, the sort of intellectual cadre that leads the sort of thought leaders of the anti-democratic movement. I talk about the sort of role that the very political pastors play in the key strategists. And of course, there's the rank and file, the foot soldiers.
I want to stay on that point for a moment. Then I want to talk about education and bring Harvard into this, because so much of what you write about is the importance of education. And now in your conclusion, which, by the way, I thought the conclusion was beautiful. I thought it was another whole book. You quoted Jefferson, who really talked about that democracy would depend on an educated public, that if the public wasn't educated, you would lose your democracy. You really couldn't hold on to it. And I recently saw a video of Bernie Sanders from 21 years ago talking to a classroom full of students. And he asked this question. I want to read it and get your quote on it. He said he was asking this question: if you had policies that involve tax breaks for the very wealthy, reducing or abolishing the minimum wage, destroying Social Security and Medicare as we know it, destroying public education, you couldn't win on that. He said, so the way you would have to win is to divide people, to tell them that affirmative action is ruining the world for white people, that uppity women are taking over the world, that the elite are against the common man, that you'd have to pit gender against gender. And I couldn't help but think that that's exactly what happened, isn't it? That they use these culture wars and division often artificial divisions to really create a movement that is anti-democratic. And so I'm wondering what Bernie Sanders kind of had it right, didn't he? That's exactly what they wound up doing.
Well, wow, so much to say here. Divide and conquer, I would have to say, is the oldest trick in the book, isn't it, when it comes to the art of war? And one thing that I will say is that I think that if we want to say, some people say that the left made mistakes here when it comes to the unfolding polarization that we see. But here's the thing. The role of the sort of moderate liberal left, when I'm going to use this big tent, I'll call it the left, but it's really this sort of large spectrum, is really quite small in comparison with the right. Now, to be sure, Democrats have made some fair number of tactical errors and played into some right-wing narratives, but one side fundamentally respects democracy and wants to uphold or improve it in its institutions, and the other side just wants to tear it all down, wants to tear down the institutions of democracy, including the university system if they can't control it. One of the sort of classic elements of a fascist playbook is to coerce cultural and educational and scientific institutions to conform to the ruling party's ideological agenda. So, the demands behind the current administration's illegal, I would say, hostage taking of Harvard, really, is that they want the MAGA clique in power to control the hiring of faculty, the curricula, which students they can accept or not, right? And the indoctrination of those students. And this is a kind of government manipulation of the pursuit of knowledge that democracies abhor, but fascists always promote. Now, I want to go back to sort of the issues on sort of the left. I think the biggest error the left has made, frankly, is the same one that the left played in the rise of fascist movements in 20th century Europe. And that is the moderate liberal left allowed itself to be divided. And many of its leaders came to see their biggest opponents as other people within that broad cohort and not those on the right. I mean, some intellectual historians and pundits and activists, and even, yes, politicians, spent years saying that Trump isn't a fascist and the real enemy is, say, Clinton centrists, or alternatively, the left wing of the Democratic coalition. I'm not blaming one side or the other, just noting that there has been a division. So then we get a divided Democratic Party, and that has opened the door to Trump, right? Because it's depressed enthusiasm for voting on the Democratic side of the political aisle, and it's inhibited people from working together because they hate one another more than they hate, the real problem that we're facing. And, again, this is similar in the early to mid 20th century when the Nazis were rising. Back then, the left was bitterly divided too, and its different elements frankly couldn't work together. They hated one another more than they hated Hitler, which I would say turned out to be a pretty colossal mistake. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I would agree. Now here's where it gets interesting to me. You opened the book, so the door, so I'm going to go into it. I was really struck by something you said at the beginning. I agree with so much that's in your book. There was something you said at the very beginning that I disagree with, but then I was interesting because I felt at the end of the book, you kind of came around a little bit. You said in your introduction to the book something like this: there are many people who say Americans just need to talk to each other more and understand each other. But you sort of said that was a nostalgic idea that, whose time had kind of passed because of this new, deeply organized movement that has not been an accident, but been 20, 30 years in the strategic making. But then at the end of the book, and I disagreed with you at the time when you said that, and I'll tell you why in a moment, because you came back to it at the end of the book when you said, well, actually, we're in the majority, that the majority of Americans are not actually at either extreme. And one kind of maybe not correction, but maybe language for me, there actually is a moderate group of Americans that are actually some lean Republican and some lean Democrat. But there actually is much more of a middle than we imagine. I know this because I spent half the year in Palm Springs. And I know a lot of Republicans there, and almost none of them are MAGA Republicans. Almost none of them are in favor of creating an anti-democratic society. And Time Magazine ran an article a year ago about the illusion of polarization, in which they looked at the fact that Americans believe they're more polarized from each other than they actually are. And that most Americans on all these issues, from abortion to immigration to fiscal, are somewhere in the middle. That actually is the majority of Americans, except for those who really follow politics religiously on both sides, who actually have quite extreme views from each other. I'm not saying there are extreme views, in the abstract. That's maybe a subjective view, but I'm wondering how you feel about the possibility of us coming together when we're not as divided as it appears. Because I believe that, and I just finished with this thought, I have a belief that both parties have an interest in division. And as Van Jones said about immigration, he said the problem with immigration is, and he's as democratic as they come, he said the problem with immigration is neither party wants to solve it, because if you solve it, you can't run against each other on it anymore. But let's not get into that rabbit hole. But what's your thought about the fact that Time Magazine had some really solid research that we're not nearly as polarized as we seem. And you even said this is not about the majority of Americans, it's about a well-organized minority of Americans. So let's talk about that, because I think it's an important issue.
Yeah, that's really true. And, thank you for the question. I think that perhaps you misread the sentence that you're referring to in the beginning of the book. I was really referring to the attack on democracy. The attack on democracy itself is not coming from both sides. There's a movement underway to destroy democracy, frankly, that controls most of the levers of power in Washington, D.C. There's only one side, one movement that wants to destroy institutions, is flouting the rule of law, that wants to destroy public education, the independence of the judiciary, et cetera, et cetera. One side that allows its leader to flout laws that it disagrees with and is violating norm after norm after norm until the goalposts are no longer even on the playing field. And you either sort of accept that reality or you look for ways to evade it. But what you pointed to toward the end of the book is absolutely true. I think more Americans would prefer to live in a democracy than want to live, imperfect as it may be, but a society run on democratic ideals and with rules of law that everyone has to adhere to, including those in power, than want to live in a kleptocratic, nepotistic autocracy with theocratic features. I think probably most Americans are actually on the 40-yard line of our politics on one side or the other. So I'm absolutely in agreement with you in that way. The point that I'm making is that the anti-democratic movement, and indeed the Trump administration, isn't trying to practice politics within a traditional framework. They're really trying to destroy the checks and balances of a democratic political system so that everything bends to the power of the leader. And that's what autocrats try to do. And again, at the end of my book, I have a number of concrete suggestions for things that people can do as individuals, as well as the things that they can do when they join together with others. And if you sort of read closely, you'll see that having conversations is really the key. I mean, we all have a sphere of influence, and there are people in our world. We need to help communicate to people the issues that really matter, get them out of some of this culture war nonsense that, we could all argue about endlessly and frankly doesn't, some of those issues have very little meaning or no relevance whatsoever in people's everyday lives. We really need help people understand, if you care about the rule of law, if you care about financial stability, if you care about our international alliances, if you care about consumer protection agencies, if you care about Social Security and Medicare and even just government services that people have paid for and need and want, if you care about weather protection, if you care about the safety of airline safety, nuclear safety, these very basic things, you should really care about what's happening in our politics.
Yeah,
And those issues, not on some of this culture war nonsense that the right would like us to be distracted by.
yeah, and I know Alon's going to take us another direction in a moment, but fair point. And I think the main point I wanted to make was that you're right about there's only one group of people, so to speak, on this anti-democratic crusade. Yet I think the mistake many people on the left make, and this really came out in this time referencing this research about the illusion of polarization, is that there's a tendency for people on the left to believe that everyone who voted for Donald Trump is in this camp, and they're not. Because if we believe they are, we will act differently than if we believe that they aren't.
And I think as the policies really just we're hearing now that he's losing a lot of his rural support because of these ridiculous trade wars. I think with those wokety wokesters at the Wall Street Journal called the dumbest trade war in history. Now some of the traders are starting to call it taco, which means basically, I can't remember the acronym. I apologize. It's something along the lines of he's going to give up on whatever policy he's introducing and he's going to go back on it. So I'm sorry, I forget what the acronym means. But what they're doing is they're making jokes about how he goes back on all these decisions he makes. You just can't trust what he says from one minute to the next. I mean, most Americans do not want to have a president who is just so shambolic. So I think we need to meet people where they are.
Alon, over to you. Thanks. Agree.
Yes, Catherine, you have alluded to the money part of your title, and I wonder whether you would be willing to talk about the lies part.
Ah, yes. Well, thank you so much. How do we talk about the lies? I mean, they come thick and fast. I mean, the disinformation campaigns and propaganda campaigns are really extraordinary. I mean, this is a movement that sort of lies constantly. They really seem to be engaged in a constant and ceaseless war on the truth. And you hear it from everywhere, Fox News on over to, the sort of far right disinformation sphere, the QAnon, the Reawaken America. There's a chapter in my book, Money, Lies, and God, where I go to We Reawaken America. For those of you who don't know, it's a traveling, I would say, pro-MAGA conspiracy fest. They set up in mega churches around the country. Each one draws thousands, and the messages at Reawaken America. Oh, and by the way, one of the Trump kids usually speaks, on the stage, and Mike Flynn is one of the organizers. So it's organized by some of Trump's closest allies, and even some of his kids are participating. And you go into this space and you're hearing about the great replacement, and they're trying to microchip you, and the World Health Organization is engaged in this conspiracy with the deep state and the one world government. I mean, JFK is alive. There's every single conspiracy you can imagine in one space. And of course, the overarching lie is that Donald Trump, 2020 election was stolen. Every accusation against him is nothing but all of his felonies and all of his, criminality. That's all just a deep state plot. And he's a white hat fighting the black hats, and he's got God's hand on his side. There's a lot of art in these spaces where you see a picture of Donald Trump's face with a young Arnold Schwarzenegger's body, and Jesus is on one shoulder with an eagle on the other. And then they have a whole parallel conference for the hyper political pastors that play a really important role in spreading these messages through to the Christian nationalist movement. These sort of messages of this kind of disinformation sphere sort of spreads out throughout the system. And it really exists to make people afraid. They are coming for you in your house. They are going to change your gender against your will. The public schools your kids are being sent to, they're nothing more than, woke indoctrination, Marxist indoctrination factories. And soon we're all going to have to be, joining these Marxist struggle sessions. I mean, all this sort of nonsense. And we've never been in a situation in America we've seen conscious programmatic disinformation on this level. And it's made our country, frankly, more unreasonable, less governable. And that clears the way for a strongman to come in and say, I alone can fix it.
It's a really important point you make in the book, I think, about the if there's a road to fascism, a road to dictatorship, this is the path, right? And if you look at what happened in Nazi Germany, and I am not comparing Donald Trump to Adolf Hitler, I think the left does an incredible disservice to our cause when we do that, because it only people just roll their eyes, because I do not believe for a minute Donald Trump's going to start sending people to death camps, et cetera. So we make a big mistake by doing that. But the tactics of fascists, of dictators, have always been the same: ban the books, divide people, create a common enemy, control information, shut down dissent, create chaos, etc. So it's a really important point that you make. I want to ask for something a little more visceral here. One of the things that struck me when I listened to your book, I didn't read it, I listened to it, I enjoyed it a lot. Maybe the wrong word, enjoyed. I found it thought-provoking. And it's hard to enjoy it in the sense of, wow, I'm so glad this is happening. Is there one story that stands out? One thing that struck me in the book is you didn't just kind of read articles. You went out and attended conferences and events, often, I don't want to say pretending to be one of them, but at least coming as a neutral person, right? To putting on the name tag and attending some of these events. Is there one story or moment that stood out to you where it really just maybe struck you deep to the core about this movement? Is there any one moment, or it doesn't have to be the moment, that stands out when you say, wow, because you were experiencing it in the moment?
Yeah, thank you. There are so many stories, but I'll point to one. I'm sitting, the way I've been doing my research for 16 years, I go to the places where it's happening, where the, strategy gatherings and conferences. So I'm at a Moms for Liberty conference. It's, I think in 2024, maybe maybe late 2023. And Moms for Liberty, as you know, is a supposedly grassroots movement. They're showing up at school boards and demanding they stop teaching CRT, which public schools don't teach. I mean, I'm a public school mom myself. The public schools are where kids learn how to read and do math and learn state capitals. But, this is what they hype up. They find some little thing somewhere and they hype it up, or they just make stuff up. So I'm at a Moms for Liberty conference. I'm sitting next to this lady at breakfast, and like a lot of the people I meet in these spaces, she seems really sweet. She's beautifully dressed. She was really not terribly politically active. We start chatting until Moms for Liberty, she joined Moms for Liberty. She'd maybe, argue, she'd signed a couple of anti-abortion petitions and done some like clinic stuff, because she was anti-abortion because of her faith, but she wasn't, really that active. And I said, until she joined Moms for Liberty. And I said, well, what caused you to join Moms for Liberty? And she said, I discovered that there was a book in the school library that was just up, they shouldn't have. And I said, wow, what book was it? And she said, The Diary of a Young Girl, which is the diary of Anne Frank, who was a Jewish girl who hid during the Holocaust and then was eventually found and murdered. And I was trying to sort of wonder what it was about this book that was objectionable to her. So I said, what do you think it was about the book that you objected to? And she said, the lesbian scene. And I was really taken aback, because if any of you have read The Diary of a Young Girl, Anne Frank's diary, there is no lesbian scene. It just didn't happen. But she'd found somebody, not her actually, it's a woman named, I think, Karen Englander, who has a sort of group, I believe she calls it Kitchen Table Activist. She's one of these people who combs through books and finds books that are, some of them in public school libraries or just public libraries anywhere, and will find some passage that she finds particularly objectionable, and then take this teeny little tiny molehill over here and turn it into a mountain and get all these Moms for Liberty completely hysterical about some perceived horror. And so Karen, what's her name? One of these folks had found a passage, a very brief passage in this long, many hundreds of pages book about the Holocaust, where Anne and her friend are sort of pledging their friendship to one another. It's not a lesbian scene. But this woman had sort of turned it into something that it patently was not. And the woman who, Anne's friend, who actually did survive the Holocaust, later said, that's not what this is about. This is what young teenage girls, we were just pledging our friendship and that's it. There was no, we were not. But it was this passage that this woman had been persuaded was so terrible that she decided to become a full-bore Moms for Liberty activist and, work toward tearing down the public schools. Now, here's the thing about this movement. It's very good at tapping into, I would say, sometimes unexamined prejudices. So if you'd scratched the surface on this woman, if I'd talked to her a little longer, I might have discerned some anti-Semitism. I definitely would have discerned some homophobia. But the fact is she had been lied to, and the lies had mobilized her toward anti-democratic means. And if you asked her, do you want to destroy democracy? She probably would have said no. And if I'd said to her, are you a Christian nationalist? She probably would have said no. I mean, my guess is she, would have said no, not at all. I'm a conservative, whatever, her denomination might be. But you can see that a lot of the rank and file are mobilized by these lies. So that's why I put lies in the smack dab center of the title of my book, Money, Lies, and God.
Yes, thank you for the story. And we're wondering, what can we do to change this? What needs to happen now? And are there examples of healing divides in this country that actually can inspire us to do so?
Thank you. I love that the title of your project is The Way Forward, because we need to talk about the way forward.
Yes.
And I, offer some really concrete suggestions for things people can do as individuals in the final section of Money, Lies, and God. And I also talk about things that we can do better when we join together with others. And I also offer some recommendations we can sort of take on as a society once we can regain enough political clout to consider the reforms that we need to sustain our democracy. So I want to summarize some of these, but I don't have time to get into all of them. But the first thing I want to say is there's no substitute for getting out the vote, right? All that matters is who turns out on election day. We have elections in less than a year and a half, and we have a chance to sort of staunch some of the, slow roll some of the damage, certainly until we can get to the next presidential election. So don't just commit to voting yourself. We all have a sphere of influence. Get out your family and friends, hold them accountable. If you're part of a faith community or a book club or any other kind of sporting group, any other kind of group, reach out to the people in your sphere and tell them what really matters. Help them understand why their vote counts, and help them see whatever their issues might be. Spend time listening, understand what their issues are, and then spend time trying to help them see, if they're hung up on these culture war issues, help them see the broader picture. Second, again, I think we need to remember that we need a big tent. We need to build coalitions. I mean, folks on the sort of moderate liberal left, sort of, center, I would say true conservatives are a very big, noisy group. We're not going to agree on everything. We're not all going to get everything we want. And frankly, we probably shouldn't. It's like being in a family with 12 kids. Is everybody going to get what they want? No, they're not. But if we can agree on more than we disagree on, then I think we can work together. And then a final recommendation I want to offer here is that organization works. The right succeeded not because they had a single leader or a single compelling message or set of messages, but they succeeded over time because the strength of their movement is in that dense organizational infrastructure, much of which functions as a giant voter turnout machine. They are in the minority, but they turn out the vote in disproportionate numbers. So think about like in the 2024 election, Trump won by a smaller percentage than Joe Biden won in 2020. And yes, we need compelling and charismatic leadership. That would be super helpful. But also, we need to mobilize the vote. There's no substitute for that. And when it comes to organizations, there's some really fantastic ones out there. And I just, do a little bit of research. I can't tell like every individual which organization that they should contribute to, but there's so many wonderful sort of democracy building organizations out there, and they all like need and deserve our support.
So, Katherine, in a moment, I'll wrap up, but I'll ask you one last question we often ask our guests, but you must answer with one sentence, give you two at most. Having done all this research and been out there talking to people, what nonetheless gives you hope about the way forward from here, especially for America? What gives you hope, having in a couple of sentences at most?
I'll give you a 3-word answer. Does that work?
That works. I love it.
It's not 3. Hope is in the struggle. 5 words. Hope is in the struggle. When you join together with others, you are living in the solution, and you also meet some of the most fantastic people.
Wonderful. Well, first of all, thank you, Katherine, for the conversation today, but also for your work over these last several decades. I do recommend the book to people wherever they are on the political spectrum. I think it's a worthy and important read, Money, Lies, and God. You used a quote in a couple of things stand out to me. You said, what we have is the result of a disproportionately organized minority. And the corollary to that is you said victory came from a long-term systemic organization aiming to win a culture of anti-democracy. And it occurs to me it's very important for our listeners to understand that this isn't about the issues of the day. We can disagree on the issues of the day, whether it's abortion or how the border or how we spend our money or the role of government. But this movement to undermine democracy, to have a minority tell the majority, or at least another significant minority, what they have to read, the kind of students they can have, what kind of ideas they can have. This is dangerous. It's anti-American. And however you feel about these issues, you need to come to the cause of democracy, of preserving our democracy as it was intended to be. You also attributed a quote to Ronald Reagan, who said, the person who agrees with you 80% of the time is not your enemy, nor the person who disagrees with you 20% of the time a traitor. And if I were to say one of the things that the left is guilty of, is I believe we have made legitimate disagreement into anti-democratic points. It's not anti-democratic to question whether the government is bloated or has inefficiency. It's not anti-democratic to question whether open borders is a good idea. It's not anti-democratic to be pro-choice. When I was in seminary, I had a beautiful friend named Julian Newhouse, and I'm going to mention him for a very specific reason. He was as liberal on every issue you can imagine: social justice, immigration, helping the poor, inequity in society, but he was rabidly anti-abortion. And when I asked Julian why, he said, you and I just have a fundamental disagreement about when life begins. He said, I believe that life begins at conception, that is a human being. He said, if you believe that, you would have to be against abortion because you would see it as genocide. Now, I don't agree with Julian on that, but the point is, he blew all my stereotypes about people who were against abortion. And my point here is not to make a statement about abortion. I'm pro-choice, have been all my life. But the point is, when we demonize people because they disagree with us, we conflab two different things. This is about an anti-democratic movement that we all can join in. And finally, I want to say to all those moderates out there, we need to organize. Because if there's one group in America that is disorganized beyond belief, it is this vast group in the middle that are moderate Republicans and moderate Democrats who want common sense solutions to come together. We're as disorganized as can possibly be. We have no organization. And if anyone wants to start a movement of us, I'm the first one to join the chorus. But Katherine, thank you. It's an important book, and everyone should read it. Money Lies in God. Let's preserve our democracy. You, our listeners, thank you for joining us. Please subscribe to our content on whatever platform you're on. It helps us and it helps you to find out the content is coming. Second, check out our website, wayforwardpodcast.com, so you can join our community. That's wayforwardpodcast.com. And I'll remind you what we remind you every time on this podcast. History is not a destination waiting for us to arrive. What we will one day call history will be the result of what we do in this very important moment, in this democracy that we love. And wherever you are in the world, stay in that movement. And we'll see you next time on The Way Forward.
Thank you for joining us in this episode of the Way Forward Regenerative Conversations podcast. I'm Jim Burke, the producer. We'd like to extend our heartfelt thanks to our sponsors, Elders Action Network and Elders Climate Action, for their unwavering support in making this podcast possible. Their dedication to empowering elders to take action on climate change and social justice issues is truly inspiring. If you found this conversation as enlightening and motivating as we did, please subscribe to our podcast and YouTube channels. Your subscription helps us continue bringing these vital discussions to a broader audience. Don't forget to share this episode with your network, and let's work together to build a better world for all generations. Find us on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, and now on Instagram and YouTube Shorts. Together, we can make a difference. We'd love to hear your feedback on today's episode and any suggestions you have for future guests. Please send your thoughts and recommendations to thewayforwardrc@gmail.com. Your input is invaluable in helping us shape the future of this podcast. To learn more about our sponsors and get involved, visit Elders Action Network at eldersaction.org and Elders Climate Action at eldersclimateaction.org. Thank you for being part of the Way Forward community.